Okay, so I mentioned I was going to give you a demonstration of the dice pools in action in the game. And so before I jump right into that, I wanted to show you guys a copy of what the character sheet looks like. So here we have the character sheet for Siegfried Hirsch, the boatman. And you can see over on this left-hand side here, lists your character's attributes, or characteristics as they're called in the game. And you have 6 basics: strength, toughness, agility, intelligence, willpower, and fellowship. And inside these little diamonds there is actually where you write the value, the value of those attributes. And so you can't see it too well, but so for example, Siegfried has strength of 3, toughness 3, agility 4, intelligence 3, willpower 3, fellowship 2. These little white boxes over here on the side indicate fortune dice, which is a way you can kind of incrementally increase your attributes without increasing them a full attribute die. And it's a little cheaper to do it through these adding these fortune dice. And then over here lists the all of the basic skills, and the top grouping is your physical skills like weapon skill, athletics, ride, resilience, and down here is your mental skills: intimidation, deceit, knowledge, skills, and all that kind of thing. And then these little white boxes, of course, over here, this column tells you which attribute each skill uses as a default. And then this tells you, these little boxes are marked off as you gain skill training in any of these skills. So if you have a little box marked like that, that means you have one level of training, and each level of training that you have in a skill lets you add a expertise die whenever you're using that skill. And then the rest of the character sheet has the standard stuff, name and character race and everything. Over here indicates your wound threshold, so as you can see, Siegfried has 12 wounds. That's how much damage he can take before being rendered unconscious. Specializations to your skills, any special abilities from race or anything like that, your equipment, any advanced skills you have. And the back of the sheet has additional stuff like further equipment, any insanities, or conditions, money, and then this side is all about your character's advancement, so how much experience you've earned and how you can and have spent your experience to improve your character. So that makes up the character sheet, but there's another element to it as well. So you have your character sheet, and then you also have your career sheet, and the career sheet tells you a bit of information about, or all the information about how your career influences your character. So it tells you which attributes your character will, if this is your beginning career, which attributes you have that are higher. You get 1 point to these attributes. This tells you which skills you can acquire in the course of that career. This tells you your career's stance, and I'll talk about the thresholds of those a little later. And then this tells you how your character can advance while in that career, how many times they can purchase these different abilities like extra wounds, extra actions, talents, skills, etc. And then finally over here, and I'll talk about this more in detail later, but these are your talent sockets. And so talents are effectively like feats. So what this means is that at any one time, the boatman career can potentially have up to 1 focus and 1 tactic talent active at the same time. So there's kind of a limit, and there's rules for how you can alter your character's active talents. But there's rules that limit how many different feats essentially you can have going at the same time, which is just kind of a balancing mechanic against the problem that often crops up in games like 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, where you have 20 feats that all have different abilities and they all stack with each other, and it can kind of create a mess. But anyway, I'll go into that more in detail later. So let's just take a quick sample example roll, and let's see how it plays out for Siegfried. So let's say that he's been kind of traveling on the road. He had to leave his boat behind because he's trying to go collect a friend of his to sell him some information that he thinks would be valuable. And he knows that he's been kind of he's been traveling this one road, and figures that he's heard that he's staying at this local coaching inn. And so he's been traveling down, he finds the coaching inn. Unfortunately, it's really heavily storming outside, and so he wants to get in out of the rain as quickly as possible, but nobody's answering the door. The door is closed and locked. It's late at night, and he can't get anybody to come to the door, so he decides that, rather than risk his health staying outside, he wants to get in, and he's willing to bust down the door to do that. So, busting down the door is a strength check, so that makes sense, right? So, Siegfried has 3 in his strength, which means that his dice pool begins with 3 characteristic dice. Now, busting down a door isn't really a skill check per se. There's not really a skill associated with it. I mean, maybe you could argue athletics, but Siegfried isn't trained in athletics anyways, so that's not going to influence his roll at all. So really that basically is it as far as what he can contribute. So now the GM just decides, how difficult is this door to break down? Okay, well, it's made from pretty solid wooden planks. It's got a hefty wooden latch on it. It's intended to keep people out. And so it's not an easy task, but he said it's also not the toughest thing in the world, so he's going to assign it a difficulty of 2. So he adds 2 challenge dice to the die pool. And he says that because it's been raining, the road's kind of reduced to muck, and it's hard for Siegfried to get footing to kind of like pry this thing open, he decides that it's also worthy of adding a misfortune die to the die pool to represent a negative circumstance that could impact his roll. And so basically that's his roll right there. So Siegfried's player would pick up all these dice, and he'd roll them, and see what we get. So, what we see right away happened is that Siegfried succeeded. In fact, he succeeded very well. He got 3 successes. All of his attribute dice came up successes. So, in one good solid slam, he knocks the door, he knocks the latch off and knocks the door swinging freely open. Unfortunately, he also rolled 2 banes. And so the GM might use that as a prompt to say, okay, well, you slam this door open, the latch busts, it flies off its hinges. You've done a fantastic job of getting the door unstuck, but unfortunately, when you did that, and you slammed your shoulder into this thing, and you bruised the heck out of your shoulder, and so you take 1 fatigue, and so he will, throw a fatigue, 1 point of fatigue on Siegfried, and I will talk about how fatigue and stress affect your character at a later point. But so that's a very excellent example of how you can have an action that succeeds and yet have negative results that come about. Likewise, you can have actions that fail. You don't roll any successes, but you might actually get a little lucky if you roll some boons and have some kind of minor stroke of luck kind of swing your way. So now let's move on to a combat example. So let's say that, he busts down the door to this coaching inn, and he realizes what's going on. Why nobody was coming to the door is that a group of highwaymen have kind of sacked the place. They're holding everybody at sword point because they're trying to camp out and hide from the local road wardens who have been on their trail. Now, Siegfried didn't really expect this. He's kind of caught unawares, but at the same time, seeing this door come flying off its handles the way that it did, all of a sudden, we'll say that the highwaymen are equally caught off guard, and so I will not bother with initiative. I'll give a much more detailed example of combat using multiple characters and how the initiative system works again later. But so let's just say that Siegfried decides that he's not going to kind of take this lying down. He decides he wants to spring to action and try and rescue the innkeeper and the other patrons that are being held hostage. And so he draws his rapier and he decides to run the closest highwayman through. So this is a melee combat attack, which uses strength as its default attribute. So again, Siegfried would start with 3 attribute dice. Now, if he were trained in weapon skill, which he is not, he could add an expertise die, but he doesn't have the benefit of that, so he doesn't get to add those bonus dice to his pool. Now, all all attack actions have a base difficulty of 1 challenge die. And we'll say that though Siegfried he kind of wasn't really expecting it. He's kind of caught off guard by this scenario, and so he's just kind of hastily jumping to action. So that might make him slip up and act inappropriately, and so the GM decides to add a misfortune die to his pool, but at the same time the GM says, well, you know, these guys weren't really expecting it either, you know, for you to come flashing in like you did, drawing your sword, and so he decides that fortune smiles, or, you know, there's potentially positive modifier to Siegfried's roll from the fact that he's kind of caught them unaware. And so this would be his basic attack, his action die pool. Now, we'll say that he decides that he wants to be very careful in terms of he wants to slash the highwayman and run him through, and he doesn't want to accidentally hit one of the hostages, so he decides that he's going to be conservative. He's going to take his time to line up his strike and make sure that he gets it right. So we'll say that he's just at stage 1 of conservative, which means that he can replace one of his attribute dice with a conservative die. So he takes one of his attribute dice away, and he adds 1 green conservative die to his die pool. And so that becomes his roll. So he would pick up his dice and roll them and see what happens. Aha! This is neat. So we see what happens is that Siegfried succeeded at his attack. In fact, he owes his success in part to the fact that he was being conservative, because he rolled a success with a delay on his conservative die. He rolled an extra success on his characteristic die, but he did roll 1 challenge, which cancels one of his successes out. So that's what he's left with. So thanks to being so cautious and lining up his strike, he manages to successfully hit the highwayman with his rapier, run him through. Because he was taking his time, however, the GM can assign has a couple of different options in terms of how to resolve this delay, either by pushing him down on the initiative, so the next round he might not get to act before the highwayman as he did this round, or he might give him a penalty to his defensive actions, meaning that, you know, he took too much time lining up his strike that now he doesn't have enough time to parry the next attack that comes at him. But because of the decisions he made, he was successful, and he, you know, inflicts damage, you know, inflicts an attack on the highwayman, does however much damage, which may or may not kill the highwayman, depending. You know, that is basically how the action resolves. And so one of the interesting things about the way these dice work in this game is that, again, when I do my more detailed example with multiple characters, you'll see it a lot more in action. But that generally what you want to do is you want to describe what you're attempting, but you don't want to go into too much detail before you roll the dice, because the dice actually tell you a bit of a story. They tell you the elements that influence the resolution of the action, and they tell you how or why or in what manner your character succeeds or fails, and what happens as a result of that action, you know, through the banes and boons and everything. And so that's a very quick example. So now I left out a whole bunch of details. There's a good bit more that I'm going to showcase in a short time, such as the action cards, which we did not demonstrate any action cards in this combat. The talents, a bit more about how your stance works, initiative, and all that other good stuff. But I hope this gives you a really good example, really quick, simple example of how the dice work, how quick and easy it is to form a dice pool, how you can kind of visualize the different elements that influence your roll, and how to read them on the table, and how you can kind of tell a bit of a story of your character's action through these different dice. So we will return in a moment with some more detail about actions and action cards.